Someone is lying about the nanobots. After Grey Goo, we finally know what the people behind the silos wanted us to believe about the apocalypse. Weaponized nanotechnology was being developed by rival nations. Iran had created a nanoweapon. Charlotte's squadron was sent into danger partly to determine what that weapon could do. The cloud that destroyed the aircraft was the weapon itself. And that explains why the silos were built. At least, it explains the version of the story that Stensen and Senator Thurman wanted Daniel and Helen to hear. Because the more we learn about the original silo project, the harder it becomes to believe that the nanobots alone explain everything that came afterward. The silos were already being constructed as humanity's backup plan. 50 underground sites were planned, with people, knowledge, and genetic material preserved so humanity could eventually return to the surface. Stensen believed advanced technology, especially nanotechnology, could become an extinction-level threat. That part is now confirmed, but then you look at what the silo system eventually became. Every community was isolated. History was deliberately restricted. Contact between silos was forbidden. People were punished for asking certain questions. And most importantly, every silo was given a safeguard capable of killing its entire population. That last part is where the nanobot explanation starts to feel incomplete. If the original goal was simply to protect humanity from an outside catastrophe, why would the people inside the shelters need to be controlled so aggressively? The answer may be hiding in the difference between the original silo project and the system we see centuries later, because those might not be the same thing. Stensen's explanation in Grey Goo gives us a reason to build underground shelters. It does not necessarily explain why the residents were eventually turned into isolated populations living under an authoritarian system. That distinction has been sitting in the story for a long time. Think about what Bernard learns. For decades, he believed his job was to prevent Silo 18 from opening the doors. He believed rebellion could lead to disaster because the people themselves might expose the silo to whatever was outside. Then Lucas discovers the truth about the safeguard. The system doesn't merely wait for a silo to destroy itself. Someone can decide that the silo has become a problem and kill everyone inside. Graham Yost has even described this revelation as a major change in Bernard's understanding of his own role. Bernard thought he was protecting Silo 18 from a danger caused by its own people. He discovers that the larger system has the power to eliminate the entire silo whenever it chooses. That is a very different kind of protection, and it raises a question the show still hasn't completely answered. Who decided that surviving the apocalypse required this level of control? The nanobots may explain why humanity went underground. They don't automatically explain why humanity stayed obedient. Look at the original people involved. Stensen is a technology billionaire who believes humanity's own technological progress could destroy the species. Thurman is a political operator who understands the value of secrecy. They are willing to manipulate information, conceal the real purpose of military operations, and use people as part of a larger plan. Charlotte's story is probably the biggest warning sign. She learns that her mission wasn't exactly what she thought it was. Her squadron was sent toward a dangerous nanotechnology target partly to determine what the enemy had developed. Her survival gave the people behind the Silo project useful information. That means the people designing humanity's future were already willing to sacrifice individuals for the survival of the larger population. And that philosophy fits the safeguard disturbingly well. Once you accept that one group can be sacrificed for humanity's future, the next step is deciding that an entire population can be sacrificed. That may be the missing connection. The safeguard could have been created because the founders were terrified of the nanotechnology threat. If a silo became contaminated, opening its doors could potentially spread the problem. If residents attempted to escape at the wrong time, they could expose everyone else. So a kill switch makes sense. But there is another possibility. The founders realized that the greatest threat to the project wasn't only the outside world, it was information. Imagine what would happen if 50 isolated populations learned they were part of a network. They would ask who built the silos. They would ask why they were separated. They would ask whether other silos had survived. They would ask who was watching them. And eventually, they would ask whether the people in Silo 1 had the right to control their lives. That is exactly the kind of chain reaction the system appears designed to prevent. This makes Salvador Quinn's message much more interesting. Quinn wasn't simply trying to expose a historical secret. He had discovered enough about the system to understand that knowledge itself was dangerous. The coded message survived because someone inside the old system wanted another generation to know what was being hidden. The same pattern keeps repeating, and every time somebody gets too close to the machinery behind the silos, the system responds. That doesn't prove the nanobots are a lie. It suggests the nanobot story may be only one layer. There is also another clue. The people in the silos don't know the true history of the apocalypse. Their entire understanding of the outside has been reduced to one simple fact. It is deadly. They aren't taught what happened. They aren't given the history of the technology that supposedly destroyed civilization. They aren't even allowed to know that dozens of other human populations exist. That level of information control would be extreme, even if the outside were genuinely lethal. And if the nanobots were the reason for the apocalypse, the founders had a very good reason to teach people exactly how the threat worked. Instead, they created ignorance. That feels deliberate. Maybe the founders were afraid that people would try to recreate the technology. Maybe they believed ordinary people couldn't be trusted with the truth. Or maybe the real danger was more complicated than Stensen admitted. Because nanotechnology destroyed the world is a broad explanation. It doesn't tell us what the nanobots were designed to do. It doesn't tell us who created the final version. It doesn't tell us whether the technology continued changing after the apocalypse. And it certainly doesn't explain why the system controlling the silos appears to have its own intelligence, priorities, and rules. That's where the theory gets much darker. What if the apocalypse created two separate problems? The first was the nanotechnology. The second was humanity's response to it. The people who survived may have decided that giving humanity another chance required controlling humanity itself. And if that happened, the silos were built as a survival system first, then turned into something much closer to a permanent social experiment. That would explain why the system became so obsessed with obedience. Because once the founders decided that human behavior could threaten survival, every act of rebellion became more than a political problem. It became a potential extinction event. And that brings us straight back to the safeguard, because the safeguard doesn't care whether the rebellious people are right. It doesn't care whether they discovered the truth. It doesn't care whether the outside is becoming safer. It simply gives the people in control a way to erase an entire population. That is an enormous amount of power for a system supposedly built to save humanity. And I think the biggest clue is that the system has already used it. Silo 17 wasn't destroyed by the original apocalypse. Its own people were killed decades later. The safeguard was activated. A handful survived by stopping the poison from entering the silo. Then the survivors eventually died outside. That event tells us something important. The founders were still actively controlling the silos long after the original catastrophe. The apocalypse may have been the reason the doors closed. It wasn't necessarily the reason they stayed closed. And that difference could be the key to everything. There is one detail in Grey Goo that makes this theory even harder to dismiss. Stensen and Thurman know that the truth about the silo project will eventually leak. They already have a plan for that. They want the world to think the project was a ridiculous idea, something associated with Stensen's eccentricity. The project can become a story people laugh about while the actual silos continue to exist underground. That is information management before the silos even become inhabited. So, secrecy wasn't something the system invented centuries later. It was there at the beginning. That means the culture of controlled information inside the silos may have been part of the original design. And Helen immediately recognizes the problem. She sees powerful people deciding what ordinary people are allowed to know. She sees people being used for missions without understanding the full objective. She sees enormous resources being spent on preserving a carefully selected portion of humanity. Her reaction matters because she has no reason to accept Stensen's worldview. Stensen believes humanity is facing an unavoidable technological catastrophe. Helen questions whether the people building the solution can be trusted with that much power. Those two ideas may eventually collide, because if the founders believed nanotechnology could destroy humanity, they may have decided that democracy itself was too dangerous. Imagine what happens when a government knows that one scientific breakthrough could wipe out civilization. You don't need to invent a villainous conspiracy to get authoritarian decisions. Fear can do the work. The founders could have convinced themselves that secrecy was necessary. They could have convinced themselves that isolation was necessary. They could have convinced themselves that controlling reproduction was necessary. They could have convinced themselves that eliminating a rebellious silo was necessary. Each decision could be justified as temporary. Then the people who inherited the system would never know the original reason. Eventually, the emergency becomes the normal way of life. That would explain one of the strangest things about the silos. Nobody inside them seems to know when the emergency is supposed to end. They aren't waiting for a clearly defined event. They aren't monitoring a countdown to safety. They are simply told to remain underground. And whoever controls the system decides when the rules change. That makes the algorithm much more important. Because if the algorithm is connected to the original control structure, it may be operating according to assumptions established centuries earlier. The original founders could have created rules around the nanotechnology threat. Later generations could have built additional rules around those rules. Eventually, the system could be protecting itself as much as it is protecting humanity. That would explain why Silo 18 is treated differently at different moments. Why does the system tolerate some forms of rebellion while responding brutally to others? Why does it care so much about particular discoveries? Why does it need people like Bernard to believe that their own authority is absolute? And why does it hide the existence of the other silos? Because information threatens centralized control. The nanobots may be the original reason humanity needed containment. The safeguard may be the mechanism that ensures containment continues. Those are two different functions. And the people inside the silos have spent centuries assuming they are the same thing. Juliet's journey has slowly separated them. She discovers that the outside is not what she was told. She discovers other silos. She discovers that Silo 17 experienced the same kind of rebellion. She discovers that the safeguard can be physically stopped, and now the audience knows where the silos came from. But notice what hasn't been explained. We know why the founders were afraid. We don't know whether they were completely right. We know nanotechnology was dangerous. We don't know exactly how the final catastrophe unfolded. We know an enemy weapon was involved. We don't know whether that weapon alone caused the condition of the outside. And we know the silos were designed to preserve humanity. We still don't know why preserving humanity eventually required such extreme control over the people being preserved. That gap is where the theory lives. Someone could be lying about the nanobots without the nanobots themselves being fake. The lie could be about the scale of the threat. It could be about who caused it. It could be about whether the danger still exists. It could even be about what the founders intended to do once the danger passed. That last possibility may be the most important. Because the original Silo project had a simple endpoint. Humanity survives underground. The surface eventually becomes safe. People return. Civilization begins again. But the system we see doesn't seem designed for that final step. It seems designed to keep people underground indefinitely. That suggests the founders either lost confidence in their original plan, discovered something worse, or deliberately changed the objective. And if the nanobots were still active, that would provide the perfect justification. Every generation could be told the outside remained deadly. Every rebellion could be treated as a threat. Every attempt to open the doors could be stopped. The population would never have to know whether the original danger had actually disappeared. That is the real horror of the theory. The people inside the silos might be living under a rule created for a genuine emergency that ended long ago. And the people controlling the system might have no reason to tell them, because once you control the information, you control the definition of safety. There is even a disturbing connection to what Juliet has experienced. She has already survived conditions that the people inside Silo 18 were told were impossible. Her journey outside has repeatedly challenged the official version of reality. That doesn't mean the outside is safe. Far from it. The nanotechnology threat appears to be very real, and Grey Goo gives us the clearest evidence yet that the original apocalypse involved weaponized nanotech. But Juliet's story has taught us to separate two questions. What is dangerous? And who gets to decide what people are allowed to know about that danger? Those questions are becoming impossible to separate from the safeguard. If the nanobots were the reason humanity needed protection, the safeguard may have started as a legitimate emergency measure. Then somebody discovered that the same system could control an entire population. At that point, the original purpose almost doesn't matter anymore. A weapon designed to protect people can become a weapon used against them. And Silo 17 gives us the clearest example. Its people rebelled. The safeguard was activated. Most of them died. The system didn't need to prove that every person was dangerous. It only needed to decide that the silo itself had become unacceptable. That is the distinction Juliet now has to fight. She isn't only trying to save Silo 18 from poison. She's challenging the idea that an unseen authority should have the right to decide whether Silo 18 deserves to exist. And that may be why the nanobots are such an important part of the mystery. They give the founders a reason. The safeguard gives them power. The information controls give them obedience. Put those pieces together, and the silo system starts looking less like a temporary shelter and more like a civilization deliberately built around permanent containment. There is still a major possibility that Stensen and Thurman told Daniel and Helen the truth. Maybe nanotechnology really was the catastrophe. Maybe the outside is still contaminated. Maybe the safeguard really is necessary. Maybe every brutal rule inside the silos was created because the founders understood something the residents could never safely understand. That possibility has to remain on the table, but even then, one question remains. Why hide so much? If the truth is enough to justify the system, why erase it? Why make people believe their silo is the only one? Why keep them ignorant of their own history? Why give one authority the ability to kill thousands of people? And why does the system appear more frightened of people discovering the truth than it appears interested in teaching them how to survive? Until the show answers those questions, I don't think we've heard the complete story of the nanobots. Grey Goo finally told us what may have started the apocalypse. It didn't necessarily tell us what happened afterward, and that could be the difference between the story of how humanity was saved and the story of how humanity was controlled. The nanobots may have forced humanity underground. The people who built the silos may have decided what happened next. And if someone is still hiding that second part, Juliette's fight against the safeguard may eventually become much bigger than saving Silo 18. She may be fighting to find out whether the prison was ever supposed to open.